And let me just repeat that. And let me just repeat that. We are recording this session. It will be available, only to, only I think to the people in this room. It won't be published. On the other hand, if you feel like you have to go dark or whatever, know that and feel free. But I do want to welcome all the visitors and all of Boya's friends and colleagues to this really special occasion for Boya. I'm going to very briefly introduce the dissertation committee and a couple of visitors for the panel. If I can just, I'm working with a single laptop here rather than a, oh, well, okay, so I'm just going to wing it. We've just welcomed Michael Hertzfeld, who's in Harvard anthropology emeritus professor. Michael was actually been former chair of anthropology. I'm not going to do an elaborate introduction, but I do want to say that Michael has been an absolute faithful friend of the GSD and especially the MDes and both doctoral programs for years. Michael, I'm still thinking of back when we served on PhD committees together, and I think, and now I've forgotten, of course, the names that I need to remember, that you helped get these fabulous jobs. So thank you for being here, and thank you for being on Boya's committee. Peter Rowe, for those at the GSD, of course, needs no introduction, but he's professor of urban planning and design, former chair, former dean, distinguished service professor at the university, and likewise someone that Boya has been working with for decades. I'm Michael Hayes. For those of you who don't know me, I'm program director of the MDes program, which is where Boya started, and what is not unique but still unusual, actually was recruited into the doctoral program because of the success of the MDes program. So Boya has been working with all of us for years. I do want to welcome also Susan Snyder. Susan, while Boya was in the MDes program, Susan Snyder and George Thomas were area heads of the critical conservation program, which is in a way what set Boya on the track to her dissertation work. I hope we'll be joined shortly by Mohsen Mostafavi, professor of design, also distinguished service professor. And Mohsen has been very close to Boya also since her Master of Design Studies. With that, I just welcome one more time all the visitors and colleagues and friends, and ask the way we'll go is ask Boya to present a synopsis of the dissertation, especially for those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, just to give a sense of the study. And then I'll ask the primary dissertation committee to make comments, questions. I don't think we usually don't have a kind of monologue here. It will very quickly evolve into a discussion and a celebration. And Boy, you'll get us started with that.
Thank you so much, Michael. And one more thing to add, I saw Ali Makawi, the director of DDAS program, is here. So I also thank him for his strong support. Okay, so good morning, everyone, and good afternoon to Michael, who is in Portugal, and good evening to the friends and families and colleagues joining from China. I'm going to share the screen shortly. Okay. All good?
Yep.
Okay.
Good.
Cool. The dissertation is entitled "The Problems and Politics of Authenticity in Chinese Heritage Practices." I assume you have all read the abstract and the research questions, so I won't spend time reading them here. In terms of the structure, I will talk about some of the groundings of this research, Then we move to the case of Quanzhou, and then the case of Jingdezhen. And finally, we will have some discussions over the issues brought up in the dissertation. So first, why Jingdezhen and Quanzhou? I chose them as my cases because Quanzhou and Jingdezhen are two generic, yet in the meantime, special cases in contemporary China. They're both less extreme and grounded in the midstream of the genealogy between the control of nationalism and the control of neoliberal consumerism. In addition, the power of informal institutions intervenes both cases deeply, serving as a balancing force outside of the dominance of the abstract state apparatus and capital. These informal institutions have reshuffled the politics of significance and the global hierarchy of values that used to be dominated by authorized heritage doctrines. Timeliness is also an important indicator in selecting the case. Both Quanzhou's World Heritage Project and the urban revival in Jingdezhen have happened recently. Timeliness have two benefits for this research. First, it provides me with fresh materials to dissect the contemporary China's cultural position in the world and its soft power approach from a micro point of view. Second, it is rather ironic that both cities' conservation strategies began fortuitously but have unintentional positive outcomes. In addition, both cases associated with the Silk Road, which explains the multiculturalism and the openness of Quanzhou and Jingdezhen. The Silk Road is a vaguely defined historical concept with practical geopolitical meanings nowadays. The association is not only symptomatic to the current Chinese cultural diplomacy and its vision of a new geopolitical image, but also signals China's return to a prosperous past to claim its long-lost glory. As intended to be compared, the two cases obviously have distinctions. Generally speaking, Quanzhou has been a trade and transportation center, while Jingdezhen was primarily a production town. The pairing of the two sites thus could shed some light on the distinctions of politics of authenticity between livelihood-related heritage that is more dispersed in city and permeated in people's daily lives, and productivity-related heritage that is more isolated and stands on its own. The classification of heritage status also makes an impact on their heritage strategies respectively. We see three classes of heritage in each city. First, World Heritage Sites designated by UNESCO. Second, state, provincial, municipal designated heritage sites. And third, sites that have not been designated by any levels of government, but their historical characteristics have been extensively appropriated for various socio-economic and political goals. So there are three forms of authenticity that have been analyzed in this research. The first one, discursive authenticity, which means authenticity in the form of discourse and narratives. Second, affectionate authenticity that stresses on the materiality and shows tangible feelings. And third, living authenticity that is true to the evolving daily social and cultural lives. Then we have a timeline of conservation history in China. I won't go into details here, but the point here is, while UNESCO has a strong influence on Chinese heritage policies, China has also developed its own discourse and system. So we come to the Quanzhou case. Quanzhou is a municipal level port city beside the Taiwan Strait in southern Fujian province. It is the largest metropolitan region in Fujian province and an economically vibrant city in China. Historically, as a port city, Quanzhou has attracted merchants from all over the world. So it has been very multi-ethnic, multicultural, and multi-religious. In July 2021, Quanzhou's serial heritage properties grouped under the title Quanzhou Emporium of the World in Songyuan, China, became the 56th World Heritage Property in China after its initial failure in 2018. In the inscription reason, UNESCO validates Quanzhou as a maritime hub of the East and Southeast Asia trade network during the 10th to 14th century, which we will talk later. And Quanzhou has been through a very prolonged and exhaustive World Heritage inscription processes since the 1980s, involving domestic politics, the international study of overland Silk Road and the maritime Silk Road, the back and forth coordination and negotiation between China and the UNESCO, and China's own Belt and Road Initiative, etc. During the 2018 session, the decision on Quanzhou's heritage nomination entitled Historic Monument and Sites of Ancient Quanzhou was reversed from not to describe, given by the advice from ICOMOS, which is the International Council on Monuments and Sites. So it was reversed from not to inscribe to referral of nominations advocated by other member states. The advisory body, ICOMOS, had no question about the significance and the authenticity of the Quanzhou theory heritage, but suggested China should build up a more coherent storyline. It is very interesting that, in contrary to a global significance direction taken by Quanzhou nomination in 2018, UNESCO proposed it for less comprehensive regional level of significance comparable to the Minnan culture, which is a regional Han culture of southern Fujian, but also shared in eastern parts of Guangdong and Taiwan, Singapore, Malaysia, etc. So from a point of view of Orientalists, Quanzhou was still relatively distant from the birthplace of the ocean civilization, the Western Europe. So it was regarded as quote unquote regional or local. The ICOMOS experts advised China to revise the narrative of Quanzhou from a vague historic monuments and sites of Quanzhou Ceitan to Quanzhou Emporium of the World in Songyuan, China. They suggested the word emporium because an English academic book, The Emporium of the World, Maritime Quanzhou, is well known in the field of Western sinology studies. And writing the nomination text is actually like solving an equation. So the so-called outstanding universal values need to meet one of the 10 criteria set up by UNESCO. So you tailor the values according to the criteria. The nomination text in 2021 in criterion 3 describes a balance between official and unofficial institutions in the selection of the theory properties. In general, all properties in this serial nomination are part of the state endorsed institutions. It intentionally overlooks a broad range of traditional folk beliefs that have not been fully acknowledged by the government. In the ICOMOS evaluation, among the three claims showing the chart, only the last one, the criterion 4, was validated. In criterion 4, it says Quanzhou is an outstanding example of an emporium as a fulcrum at the east that functioned as an engine for the Asian maritime trade. So the Western world still refuses to acknowledge China's influence outside of the Indian Ocean before Westerners' dominance on the ocean starting from the 15th century. The fight for the World Heritage title shows the story of constructing the discursive authenticity of Quanzhou's heritage properties. The urban conservation and the regeneration will tell us more about affectionate authenticity. Unlike the World Heritage enterprise that is fully dominated by experts and nation state, urban conservation and regeneration have been a venue for various social forces to compete for their rights to reset the order of values and the hierarchy of significance. The Quanzhou municipal government proposed and carried out various urban regeneration and conservation projects in the past 30 years, usually caught in the conventional debates between modernization and conservation, between progress and tradition. A local official described to me what he views as 3 editions of historic conservation in China. The first edition of preservation kicked off at the beginning of the open reform period in the 1980s. In this edition, local authorities could not realize the values of heritage or historic environment. Consequently, the miraculous urbanization process in China in the last 40 years has been achieved through demolishing the old and building the new. The second edition made some progress over the first one. Governments took over the historic buildings and preserved them in place in a more scientific way. However, residents were displaced through eminent domain, and new forms of business or cultural operations were transplanted into the historic sites. Thus, the social ecosystem was significantly changed. The third version, superior to the last two, provides a healthy conservation mechanism to the neighborhood without displacing locals. Some measures are taken to upgrade its daily service without disturbing the overall authentic spatial forms. The lifestyles are modern inside. Quanzhou adopts the third version of heritage conservation, says the official. The primary spatial strategy in the conservation or renovation projects across Quanzhou is generally called incrementalism. But what is happening on the ground? Quanzhou's seemingly beneficial incremental conservation strategy is actually a reluctant action rather than a first choice due to the prolonged clashes among varying understandings of authenticity and between private property rights and public power. In the construction of affectionate authenticity, there are at least three problems. First is the cultural misunderstandings by non-local designers. Local design teams are often unexpectedly discarded in an enthusiastic pursuit of authentic Mingnan architecture as the new broom sweeps clean. Besides the cultural misunderstandings, the prevalent abuse of symbolism also bothers local designers, namely appropriating visual motifs and symbols that are considered as representing Mingnan culture. This symbolism conundrum stems from the set of value system UNESCO promotes through its World Heritage Program. This dogmatic external valuation system heavily relies on visuality and materiality, and thus requires identifiable spatial elements for scrutiny. The government's universal request of preserving or renovating space in historical areas based on ambiguous interpretation of authenticity has challenged the owner's autonomy in living a desirable life defined by themselves. It is the public power's encroachment on both private property rights and folk customs. A local designer provided two examples of regulating building materials in the conservation project of the Flower Lane in Quanzhou. The two examples are about the renovations on windows and roofs. So the governmental conservation plan requires each household to replace the popular stainless steel windows with wooden and stone manufactured windows for quote unquote aesthetic reasons. In practice, residents use stainless steel windows, burglar meshes, because they are cheaper and more protective. Residents were asked to tear them down, which added much financial burden to individual owners. And the government pressed hard for visual conformity and universality. In Quanzhou, those residents often complain about the government officials for their incompetency or sometimes too strong measures in urban preservation and renewal projects. The outcome of historic preservation never went too off track nor caused severe social problems. In the historic preservation process, the local government and the civil society were connected in a reciprocal but mutually resistant manner. Compromises among various social groups happen frequently. This is due to the cultural elites of the city, including government officials, serving as the intermediary agents between the global standards, national policies, and the local communities. The primary three important actors in Quanzhou's historic preservation campaign oversee Chinese groups, clans, and religious groups. I don't have time to go into details of each of the story, but I want to discuss why the Gemeinschaft, the social relations in the society, are strong in Quanzhou. Due to its frontier condition and being far from the imperial power center, local communities in Quanzhou needed a well-organized institution to realize self-governance. The autonomy brought by the long-term marginalized geographical and political position led to a blurred national boundary for Quanzhou people who form their own community built on religion and lineage. In addition, because of the protective boundaries of massive mountainous land, fewer wars or movements have disrupted the Mingnan area compared to the Central Plains. The Mingnan area has thus kept its rich traditions. The geographical extent and the cultural intensity of its rich traditions make Quanzhou a unique city, loosely attached to the central regime, pressuring for conformity. However, though informal institutions such like the local clans, the folk belief system, and overseas Chinese group help the revival of tradition, they are often excluded from the official heritage designation list as culturally inferior and a violation of national culture. The designation system is still dominated by what anthropologist Robert Redfield calls great tradition, that serves the regime as opposed to little tradition exercised by people in their daily lives. So through dissecting the construction of three kinds of authenticity, the case study reveals that the discourses and practices of heritage in Quanzhou are not being imposed simply by the top-down national heritage laws and international doctrines, nor are they merely the outcome of localizing the authorized heritage discourse. In contrast, they were born out of the social political conflicts and struggles across scales and among different actors, and continue to evolve dynamically. So in the case of Jingdezhen, I argue that the ongoing heritization process of Jingdezhen are driven by an incomplete modernization project since the Republican era, that the city largely forsakes a path of industrialization of porcelain production for a post-industrial heritage enterprise based on tourism and making customized artistic porcelains. Jingdezhen is the capital of porcelain in China. It is in a mountainous area in the northeastern part of Jiangxi province, which is a landlocked province in southeastern China. Jingdezhen became the national porcelain making center in the Ming and the Qing dynasties when the imperial court set up a specialized institution, the imperial kiln, to oversee the royal porcelain production. Jingdezhen has also been active in exporting porcelains across the globe. Its porcelain becomes a world commodity through which Jingdezhen has been linked to a complex network of transcontinental infrastructures, such as the Maritime Silk Road, and become a node of global economic activities. The spatial arrangement of Jingdezhen has centered around porcelain production. As the saying goes, the kilns are built along the river and the city emerged around the kilns accordingly. The city began to aggregate on the east bank of the Chang River. Given its mode of porcelain production, Jingdezhen's urban morphology was characterized by its north-south arterial traffic and the fishbone pattern of alleyways running east-west, connecting the kilns to the river banks and ports for raw material transportation. By the 16th century, Jingdezhen has already been China's largest porcelain manufacturing city and attracted immigrants nationwide. The formation of a multicultural city further strengthened the exchange of goods and urbanization in Jingdezhen. By the late Qing dynasty, this small handicraft industrial town was operated under a rather sophisticated managerial system constituted by the imperial kiln and the semi-autonomous social groups such as guilds, subdivided by craft or hometown. Three waves of industrialization movements have consequently emerged in Jingdezhen since the self-strengthening movement starting in 1861, but none of the industrialization movements have been successful due to the wars and the local resistance. And after the establishment of PRC, Jingdezhen expanded eastward very aggressively as the industrial structure diversified. The scattered handicraft workshops were recombined to form the concentrated industrial complexes. 10 great factories were built in the modern style with bricks and concrete. They were economical, faster to build, and suitable for modern porcelain production mode and modern workers' daily use. The scientific management mode, assembly line, and large-scale mechanization in a Taylorism thinking have significantly challenged Jingdezhen's porcelain industry that hinged on handicrafts and flexible work schedules. By 1995, most state-owned factories went bankrupt and died overnight due to the pressure from the national economic reform. Tens of thousands of workers lost their jobs and their families were placed in jeopardy. The relations of production returned from the industrialized mass production to disassociated small-scale handicraft workshops. Factory plants went dilapidated for lack of repair. When reading the preservation plan of Jingdezhen, it is evident that all designated historic cultural districts are located in the dark blue historic area of Jingdezhen in the western part of the city along the Chang River. No single preservation area or historic site addresses the importance of socialist factory remains scattered in the city, most of which are situated in the eastern suburbs. In 2012, one of the almost abandoned factories, Cosmic Porcelain Factory, was selected to be preserved because it couldn't attract any developers to develop it into high-rise residential buildings. Then it later became the Taoxichuan Creative Park project, which kicks off as a reluctant response to abysmal real estate market instead of an active pursuit of preservation practice. In 2012, Jingdezhen's municipal government commissioned the Heritage Center of Tsinghua Tongheng Planning and Design Institute to make a conservation plan. Two major areas were planned to be conserved or revitalized. On the west side is the old city center, and on the east side lies the modern socialist factories. The Tongheng team comprehensively considered the integration and synergy of urban development, factory space, programming, and public life. The design scheme was very innovative for its scope in social planning and its ambition in holistic preservation. In the permanent exhibition in the Jingdezhen Ceramic Industry Museum in the Taoxichuan Creative Park, these production facilities are preserved in situ along the production tours. In addition, workers' daily necessities, factory documents under a socialist system, and the workers' life trajectories and collective identity, and the dark history of the laid-off period are all brought to the front to visitors. Though the concept of authenticity receives a lot of emphasis during the regeneration process, how to realize the authentic environment remains a question from the perspective of design for the vagueness of the definition of authenticity. In the case of Taoxichuan Creative Park, the preservation outlook is that of the eclecticism of different preservation principles from the Venice Charter, repair the old as it is, and Fengmao. Fengmao is actually a very tricky Chinese term, generally referring to a place's humanistic characteristics and geographical features. Recognizing the dynamism of the future cultural industry, the Tongheng team works on increasing the flexibility of space to accommodate the diverse and cross-boundary functions and activities happening in the park. More importantly, at the turn of the transformation from an industrial city to a post-industrial city, it is productive and necessary to boost various kinds of lifestyles and the leisure and consumption economy. Realizing talents and human flow as the real engine for a city's development, Jingdezhen starts its transformation process from sightseeing to sightseeing to attract all kinds of people to boost its service sector and culture industry. The inheritance of the whole porcelain production procedure and the ability to create porcelain continuously become the living authenticity of the city's culture. Jingdezhen has always been an immigrant city and attracts artisans, service providers, and traders from all over the country. The Jingdezhen drifters, or Jingtiao in Chinese, could be considered the most contemporary forms of immigrants. Among many others, Sanbao International Ceramic Village, Letian Pottery Workshop, and Taoxichuan Creative Park have become the three most dominant aggregation places for the Jingdezhen drifters nowadays. The Sanbao International Ceramic Village was established by an American-educated local artist, Jackson Lee, in the late 1990s, when very few international artists have been to Jingdezhen before. The difficult living conditions and the rustic and idyllic sceneries at Sanbao attracted international artists to do porcelain works on relatively untouched piece of land. So they are very romanticizing these rustic, these rural areas. Then also an American-educated artist, Caroline Zheng, of a Hong Kong origin, founded the Letian Pottery Workshop in the old plants of the Sculpture Porcelain Factory in 2005. She wants to introduce Jingdezhen's the complete porcelain production chain to her international friends. Then she also established the Friday public lecture series, the weekend market, and the public educational programs that have deeply reshaped the socio-cultural atmosphere for Jingdezhen's creative communities. The state capital pouring into the Taoxichuan project quickly made many public programs possible, but also in the meantime, significantly disturbed the cultural ecology of the creative communities. For example, Taoxichuan's weekend market is modeled after the Letian's weekend market for gathering popularity. And besides replicating the creative market, Taoxichuan also set up its own international artist residency program with no charges to the artist. So the three groups had very serious fights over many issues, but de facto keeps a reciprocal relationship as the diversity of programs and creative activities make the cultural ecology better, more sustainable. As the three creative communities are vying for popularity among artists and creative workers by promoting their own featured programs, the backbone of the porcelain production in Jingdezhen, the local craftsmen or shifu, are less organized, studied, or even noticed. They're part of the unimpressive but very significant supporting system of porcelain production. In other words, craftsmen are the critical link to the cultural ecology of the porcelain industry. Thus, through a construction of discursive, affectionate, and living authenticity, the Taoxichuan Creative Park provides an innovative conservation method to revitalize the city and attract creative workers nationwide. As the heritage industry progresses, a promotion of creativity adds to the dimension of authenticity. The cultural ecology of creative communities becomes the living authenticity of the city's culture. A complex social and cultural system forms and is constantly reconstituted through interactions, competitions, clashes, and conflicts that are happening among various creative communities all the time. Both the city's leadership and the creative communities understand that the living authenticity of a city's social culture matters more than the authentic spatial configuration. The authentic preservation of the formal socialist factories is only a good excuse to carry forward the cultivation of culture. So finally, we come to discussions on the critics of authenticity and its politics. First, what matters is not the past, but our relationship with it. One of the contributions that the two Chinese cases have for the field of critical heritage studies is that they provide valuable experience in understanding the relational structure we have with the past and among ourselves. Through diachronic and synchronic comparisons, the two cases tell stories of how three forms of authenticity are fabricated, appropriated, manipulated, and negotiated in a dynamic heritage-making processes to reconcile the power relations among various stakeholders, respectively. Rather than asking why is authenticity political, it is probably more critical to ask, when is authenticity political? Given the cases of Quanzhou and Jingdezhen, authenticity becomes political when there is a failure of mapping living cultural practices on the authorized heritage discourse. Like other objects of modern social governance, the governance on heritage takes roots in the hegemony reproduced by a pressure for homogeneity and universalism. The cultural hegemony in heritage practices largely relies on the authorized heritage discourse that is mostly generated from UNESCO's World Heritage Program and the nation-state's desire for unified and undisputable myth of origin. Second, instead of strengthening the binary thinking, the two cases illustrated in the dissertation show us that in heritage practices of China, there is less of a clear demarcation between the majority and the minority, the ruler and the ruled, the elite and the common folk, etc. This takeaway invites us to reflect on the prevalent binary thinking in critical heritage studies. In the case of Quanzhou, on the one hand, the Chinese central government and conservation experts cognitively embrace the UNESCO discourse. They pay lip service to preservation practices as an unquestionable historical responsibility, while diminishing it as a technical issue for architects and urban designers. China also takes a culturally specific approach to UNESCO, technically meeting the requirements, then largely in favor of China's own strategies and criteria. On the other hand, the prevalent criticism on UNESCO from a cultural colonial perspective tend to oversimplify the hidden power struggles between UNESCO and the nation states. For example, people often claim that China is passively receiving UNESCO's influences. This binary way of thinking largely neglects the nation state's desire to legitimize its rule and to evoke nationalistic emotions through complying with, negotiating with, and manipulating the UNESCO doctrines. It also fails to consider locals' responses and resistance to this process. The local heritage practices in Quanzhou have been compromised to balance the interest of other solidary groups, such as the overseas Chinese, folk religious groups, and clans. Jingdezhen follows a similar path in reconciling the social relations among various creative communities to realize an optimized social interest in the heritage industry. In this sense, the two cases have problematized the binary thinking that the Eurocentric UNESCO doctrines are rigidly imposed upon China, and the locals are purely victims of the heritization process. This is not actually true. So therefore, in contrast to a binary critic of the dominator suppressing the dominated, though there are many examples of this, it is probably more constructive to analyze how the social, cultural, and political agents have empowered themselves to muddle through the contemporary Chinese heritization process and the power geometry of it. Authenticity is the tie and the means for weaving this power web. So Scale is a significant factor in the construction of authenticity in both cases. The scalar dimension of heritage are closely tied to a hierarchy of spatially bounded concepts, such as the frequently used global, national, regional, municipal, and local. Nation states often project an idealized assumption of heritage as stable, bounded, and non-overlapping. The formal classification of heritage sites and recognition of values based on a formalized value system are obviously a way of control by the nation state for a legibility project through mapping, as anthropologist James Scott has carefully illustrated in the book Seeing Like a State. The classification serves as a means to render heritage far more susceptible to careful measurement, calculation, and manipulation. But at the same time, it may cause bigger problems since the complex and sometimes contradictory interests of individuals and communities are not fulfilled on a scale of authoritative heritage system. The reverse is also true when we see the institutionalized rules are often mediated and resisted on a local scale. The failure of mapping from one scale onto another scale constitutes the core of heritage politics. So the comparison invites us to think across scales and look beyond the legibility project of the state. And both cases suggest that scale and its corresponding meanings should be much more relational, plural, and dynamic. Fourth, informal in social institutions, namely solidary groups such as overseas Chinese groups, lineages, religious groups, creative communities, are social cultural agents that hold local officials accountable in doing the right thing for communities in heritage practices. And this argument builds on theories of social capital. However, it doesn't mean that the solidary groups run parallel to or can replace the state institutions in heritage practices. From the case of Jingdezhen, we observe that the strong presence of the state-owned enterprise representing the local government could sufficiently and efficiently mobilize resources and capital to realize the heritage conservation process. And fifth, to understand the structured intricacies of social relations, we could borrow a theory of principled particularism from the sociologist Andrew Warder in his study of a mixed type of institutional culture in Chinese communist factories, in which he argues that the planned structure of factory institution is never fully implemented. The concept of the principled particularism could largely explain what has happened in Chinese heritage practice, with one significant difference. The heritage institution is intentionally made to be porous. Chinese heritage practices are made of a hierarchical institutional heritage system coupled with a porous heritage discourse. In both cases, authenticity as a key evaluation of heritage value is exemplary of the vagueness of the planned structure of heritage institutions. The flexibility and porosity of the evaluation of authenticity provide enough room for any particular interpretations and actions on heritage. The principled particularism can essentially increase heritage makers' initiatives to pursue their economic interests as well as fulfill their social and political agendas. And this kind of dialectical structure between the principled and the particular fundamentally sustain heritage practices full of contradictions and complexities. Conflicts are generated through a combination of a hierarchical heritage institution and the porous heritage evaluation system with authenticity as a central parameter. It is this very conflict itself that stabilizes the power relations around the heritage site. So finally, looking ahead, more people are interested in heritage because they expect heritage would show a humane side of our society that is under the control of modernity. However, the emergence of heritage and the heritage industry come exactly from the anxiety of unmodernity of nation state, which is also a modern construction. But after we realize that heritage cannot save us from the control of modernity, and the social constructions of the past are crucial elements in the process of domination, subjugation, resistance, and inclusion. What is the future we're looking for through heritage? First, compared to solving the problems, it is more critical to find the problems in the first place. Heritage could help us locate conflicts and change in our time. Heritage is often symbolized as a representation of harmony through a process of whitewashing and beautification that often lead to more exclusionary acts. However, an analytical attitude toward heritage could help reveal a deeper social structure that generates conflicts and change. The conflicts that heritage reveals are never the conflicts between tradition and modernization, as people often claim, but the conflicts among groups of people and among social relations. Second, heritage reminds us that any attempt to simplify or control cultural or cultural identity will fail. The basis of intercultural communication is to seek common ground while reserving differences. All of the formalized heritage institutions that seek to unify cultural meanings of specific sites would inevitably cause more social problems. Last but not the least, heritage conservation is not about keeping itself unchanged, but is a precondition to a generative transformation that makes the world go round. It is where creativity is generated from. The only thing that is constant in our life is change, and heritage should set the stage for it instead of locking the vitality of this world in a self-deceiving box. So finally, certain things are doomed to evade our desire to fix them. Thank you so much.
Bravo, Boya. Thank you so much. Yeah, we can unshare the screen. So we have time now for, first I want the dissertation advisors to have time to comment and question. Let me just first congratulate Boya on that presentation. It was, I mean, some of us have had the chance not only to read the the latest installments of the thesis, but also have seen you work through this, and I know, and Michael and Peter know better than I, the mass of data and documentation, not to mention field work under sometimes very adverse conditions that has gone into making this, and the way that you were able to organize, and you're writing every time you write it, it gets better, Boya. You're right. I mean, just the sound of your voice becomes clearer. You discover ways of saying it. I'd like to talk a little bit more about that as we go forward. But first, I'm going to ask Michael Hertzfeld. We have an unwritten tradition in the doctoral program that sometimes we ask the person who has come the furthest to be the first to comment. Of course, Zoom obviates or makes that meaningless, but nevertheless, maybe if we shift from space to time, you are the latest. You're in the later part of the day. May I ask you to open this up for comment and discussion?
Sure. Thank you, Michael. First of all, let me add my congratulations to Boya. Obviously, we could argue about all sorts of minor details in the presentation and in the thesis, but I think that's simply a sign of the richness of the arguments. It's not easy, even in a country that is less centrally controlled and less authoritarian than China today, to be able to grapple with these issues. And in fact, if I have a criticism, it's a criticism that could be interpreted in a very positive way. That is that what I think you've done, Boya, in this thesis is to show that China is in many ways just like any other country, that all the countries that are parties to the various UNESCO treaties and arrangements, and who use e-commerce standards and so on, are all actually engaged in something of the same business. That is to say, they're trying to fit a nationalistic discourse into a system that ultimately says, to be a nation state, you have to have heritage, you have to have authenticity, and then sets criteria for the definition of authenticity that actually don't, in real experience, vary very much from one country to another. So I find myself asking myself a question about your work that is not in any sense meant to belittle it, but on the contrary, say, in some ways it shows that you pushed this much further than I think anyone might have dared to expect. And that is, what makes the Chinese management of the concept of authenticity different from anyone else's? Why are they so concerned with a concept that appears to have its origins in a Western model of the idea of a person? Richard Handler, talks about the early modern concept of person as a possessive individualist, and in other words, defined by the ownership of property, shows how this is then projected onto the idea of the nation as the owner of a culture. And as you know, and I've said this to you many times, anthropologists never talk about cultures anymore. They only talk about culture in a kind of generic processual sense, because actually to talk about cultures, and of course the Chinese government does it all the time with its 56 nationalities and so on, is to reify the idea of culture and to associate it really with the model of a nation state. So with that as a background, and also with the comment that I think one of the really clever things about this dissertation is the comparative dimension, the way you've taken two cases that are significantly different, but also show together the malleability of the concept of authenticity. Let me ask you what may, without that preamble, would sound like a very aggressive question, but I think you will see that it's a sympathetic one, which is why even use the word authenticity at all? Why not just get rid of the concept and use your dissertation as a platform to say we don't need that concept? It actually creates more confusion, it creates more ambiguities, it simply runs the risk then of inviting people to say, yes, that's authentic, no, that's not authentic. Why don't we just get rid of it altogether? Why do we need authenticity? What is the value of that concept? You sort of hint at a possible answer, I think, when you talk about the way in which people, as to use your very apt phrase, they muddle through, right? They especially in the GMT case, they muddle through. They find ways of connecting the production of heritage with not just a tradition of the past, but with a social and commercial life that is ongoing. But given that the state is infatuated with this concept of authenticity, wouldn't it have been more useful to use your dissertation as a way of getting rid of the concept altogether? Or was that what you were really trying to do? Over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I want to start with the second question, why we need authenticity now. I think the point here in my dissertation is exactly they care authenticity not for the sake of authenticity. They care authenticity first because they are like from the outside, from UNESCO, which is regarded as a higher kind of authoritative system than China, right? So they need this outside concept to fulfill their own needs. And I have illustrated in the dissertation multiple times how vaguely the authenticity conception is defined. So they're exactly making use of the porosity and the vagueness of this concept to do whatever they want to conduct the urban revitalization, renewal project, etc., in the name of creating authenticity or preserving authenticity. But I think you're absolutely right that we probably need an alternative kind of vocabulary or discourse to counteract the influence of authenticity. But it is also it is also true that from all of the world, especially the non-Western world, let's use the Western for now, because I know you have many problems with the word. Many non-Western countries, the scholars from non-Western countries are reflecting upon how authenticity is abused or misused in many occasions. So I guess as long as the conservation continues of the harms authenticity bring to the local communities, it's good, because yeah, I mean, we kind of continuously criticizing the conception of authenticity, while we could also bring up some other words to replace that. But I didn't really find such things in China or in other cultural environments. Yeah.
Well, it's not just a matter of replacing the term, is it? Because, I mean, if you just replace the word with another word, you're going to end up with the same problem. It's more, I think, that what I think you do in the dissertation, although you never quite spell it out, is say at some level very clearly, but at another level very inexplicitly, that authenticity isn't really the issue at all, that it's a blind, it's a red herring. That what really is at stake here is conflict between various ways, and you've identified two out of several possibilities, various ways of mobilizing the idea of a traditional past in order to bring new life back into an old place that is dying because its traditional economic base doesn't fit the current economic situation, and has been particularly badly hit, of course, as we know, in these years of the pandemic. Actually, I think it's going to be very interesting when the pandemic finally does dissipate, as we all hope and pray that it does, to see how well the concept of authenticity is done. It may itself be a victim of the pandemic, because one of the things that keeps coming up in conversations about COVID is, is it really COVID? Is this the real thing? So that the notion of genuineness, to use a slightly different term, is very much in play. People certainly have had that issue with heritage studies for a long time. What I find interesting is that there are many good Chinese scholars, you are obviously now joining their ranks, in critical heritage studies who are not very comfortable with words like authenticity, and who also challenge the global hierarchy of value, as you've done. By the way, it's not the global hierarchy of values, and as a person who coined the term, I'm going to be a bit fussy here and say it's the global hierarchy of value in the singular. It's not a hierarchy of different values. It's a hierarchy in which the supreme value is held to be what is represented by UNESCO, which until recently was implicitly always this thing called the West. And that's precisely why I have difficulty with the term. So I think it's important to make that point clear. But with that said, and I just want to push you a little further on this, and then I'll shut up and let other people have a go. But I'm wondering why you seem somewhat concerned that your work will be seen as a criticism of the Chinese government. I see it actually as more of a very, should I say, pragmatic assessment of how the Chinese government sets out a series of rules for the conduct of heritage management, which everybody in the government knows will be differently interpreted according to different circumstances. In other words, we could read everything in your thesis as an extremely intelligent design on the part of the Chinese government to allow for a flexibility that the government cannot actually admit to in an international forum. And I wanted to see what you thought of that idea, that actually the flexibility that you're describing, the fact that there are different ways of doing this and some work better than others. Clearly, the porcelain revival is much more successful than also partly because being in Fujian province, the Guangzhou issue is also bedeviled by a larger regional difficulty in its relation to the center. But basically, the center is saying, we have a set of criteria. You have to figure out how you will fit local into those criteria. We're not going to ask any questions as long as you can produce the right kind of discursive cover that will show that every part of China is actually fully engaged in the production of Chinese heritage, and emphasizing, of course, that it's Chinese heritage as opposed to, again, what we agree has to be called in this discourse, Western heritage. So am I right, or do you not think that the Chinese government is quite so cynical and pragmatic at the same time?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So I think we all agree on the message that UNESCO, the nation state, the central government and the local government have created for its people. I'm not diminishing that part. And I think the impression you have that I'm arguing Chinese actually have a very intelligent kind of heritage system is because first, the two cases I selected are kind of the benign side of the heritage practice in China. I don't think it is very constructive to, to criticize again that the government has, the authoritarianism has done bad to the people. And also standing from a point of view that do we necessarily have to follow an anarchist way of social and heritage governance, right? Because when you are when we are criticizing the kind of formalized institution, do we want to abolish them? Do we want to abolish UNESCO or nation state at present? And can we? And even if I do want to abolish them, but the realization of it is very difficult. So one of the takeaway from my research is that we need both an abstract and the concrete descriptions of what authority means in the heritization process, like how are they implemented in practice and through whom? This is the most critical question we need to answer. And instead of seeing the officials as the evil side or as the opponent of the local residents, I argue that these local officials, especially in the case of Quanzhou and Jingdezhen, are actually cultural and social agents that translate the language for each other. And also because China has a long history of the literates or scholars of becoming officials. So they're not only representing the governmental bodies, even though that's the primary role they're playing, but also many of them are also deeply seated in other social systems, social groups. So I'm arguing here is we need to cooperate with them and to make use of them to kind of mediate the interest. Because
well, I'm totally sympathetic to what you're saying, Boyan. I think, in fact, if you look at a very early piece of my own writing, mainly the book titled The Social Production of Indifference, one of the points I make is that bureaucrats professionally have to put on a performance of indifference, and sometimes even of callousness, and certainly of disinterestedness, in order actually to carry out acts that they consider to be beneficial. And I'm sure that most bureaucrats in the Chinese system, just as in any other country, have to make those decisions on an ad hoc basis all the time, every day. And we've tended not to see that with heritage, because heritage is always designed to look permanent. But I think one of the things you've shown very clearly is that it isn't. So that in an ironic way, in the moment in which you are saying we should recognize that the Chinese state, or at least it's the people who staff it, the bureaucrats, have a very difficult job to do, at the same time, you're also actually saying, and if I'm right, then we are in total agreement that the nation state itself is part of the problem. That, as I've been arguing in my most recent book, nation states originated as bureaucratic institutions. What makes them dangerous now is that they have morphed into what I call ethno-national states. That is to say, states where everything is defined in terms of a single ethnicity. And one of the dangers that I do see in the Chinese case is that minorities are increasingly being represented as somehow fallen versions of the Han majority. I think this is somewhere there in the background. It's not part of what you talk about, but I do think that we see very similar. We see the same thing with the white power movement in the United States. The United States was set out to be an ideal example of a bureaucratic nation that became a nation by virtue of who came here, regardless of their origins. And now various groups are duking it out for total control. I see this in the breakup, which I think is about to happen, of the United Kingdom, same way. The English and the Scots are no longer willing to put up with a hierarchical relation. The English want to be in total control, the Scots want out, and so understandably, of course. So what I'm saying, I think, is that your thesis, in my view, speaks to an issue that is much larger than China. And while I think it was appropriate for you to focus on the Chinese dimension, which you do very competently, I am hoping that in some future published version of this, you'll actually talk a little bit more about, not about the uniqueness of China, which is what the Chinese government does all the time, but actually about how unbelievably typical China is, just on a very massive scale, of the behavior of this monstrosity that was created in the mid-19th or early 19th century that we call the nation state. And I think it's a very clever demonstration of that. So I was very happy with the answer you just gave me. So I think I'll just stop there, because I know there are lots of other interesting questions that are going to come up, and some of them probably more directed to very specific parts of your material. Well, thank you. And thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much. Peter, could we turn to you now?
Peter, you're muted.
Which is an unusual situation, I might say.
Sorry?
I said it's an unusual situation for you to be muted.
Oh, no. Boya sits next to me, and when she's writing this thing day in and day out, knows what a putz I am when it comes to technology. So that's why she says you're muted, even if I'm talking.
Yeah, she says it regardless.
Yeah, it's a sort of automatic gesture on her part. No, I'm very, very sympathetic to the dissertation. As you know, I've spent a lot of time in China, and I've actually been involved in quite a lot of these sort of junkets, I call it, that are related to heritage and ecomos and so forth and so on. So I can sort of see some of this from a internal, you might say, somewhat internal perspective. What I particularly liked was this distinction between heritage and history, where in fact you pursued an emphasis on heritage, along with the idea of it being very close in its scrutiny to the propositions and state endorsement of various practices. By the way, this is very, very true in architecture in general, particularly during the communist period. If we look at that very closely, the central government is never very, very far away from what actually gets built materially and always has an opinion on it. I mean, so in 2014, for example, Xi Jinping says, I don't want to see any more weird buildings. He didn't really entirely qualify what he meant by weird building, but he got the point across. And this was just a replay of what Zhou Enlai said in 1954, at a similar sort of phase in the national development. So I like this idea of heritage that you raise and the fact that that the Chinese play it. I actually agree with Michael entirely. I mean, my take has been that, in fact, China is now walking away quite strongly from anything that's Western and Western ideas. But they're doing it in a kind of a clever, they're trying to parse the difference, shall we say. As I've said to you many times, I think it's a con there in terms of the central government's role. They know very well they want to be a part of, the nation states and all this sort of stuff. I don't think they believe in that at all. I mean, if you go to Zhongguo and you think about it in terms of Chinese ideas, Tiangsha, all under one, which means everybody, is a fundamental concept in the constitution of China. So they come from a very, very different place vis-a-vis this whole idea of the collective, and they're very aware of that. But they also know they have to play the game in order to, as it were, make their way through the world. So I think Michael's entirely correct, and I wasn't sort of so fussed about authenticity because I thought, well, that's what you're looking at. But I don't really think it was useful to say things like, for example, the whole thing that you went on about, that it's somewhere between the kind of canonical forms like the Confucian Temple and the Wuzhen consumerist town of the sort of neoliberal stripe. That to me is one way of looking at the world. I'm not saying it's wrong, but I don't think it's particularly propelling. I mean, another way to think about conservation in China is between wooden buildings and in the industrialization of buildings that are made out of other stuff, for example. Because from about the Tang Dynasty onwards, which is roughly what, 1300 years, the concept of authenticity, which to the extent that they've even entertained it, has been very, very well devised. I mean, and this whole idea of change, of the change agents that go on in buildings is something that was recognized very, very early on, to the extent that the artisan craftsmen put, the stick in the roof that's told the next guys what to do. And this went on and on and on and on. So their whole idea of authenticity not being static, but being something that changes over time is deeply within the kind of cultural framework of the place. So I agree with Michael. I don't think China's coming at this question authentically, shall we say, in other words, being true to themselves as Chinese, as distinct from somebody else, anywhere near close to the Western values. And they play the game. It's a game for them, I think. In most examples I've been involved in, that's the case. I also, having said that, though, it seems to me that you do make the point that we've moved in conservation terms from the sort of discursive realm where I tell a good story in order to get past through into the kind of material aspect of that, and then into the whole idea of daily living has been a trend. And that's, I think, true anywhere in the world. I mean, in other circumstances professionally, I've worked in other sort of conservation projects in other parts of the world, for example, in Iran even, where that's been true. I mean, there's this general collapse away from just a discursive notion that I can tell a good story that allows me to get ECOMOS approval, et cetera, down to, if people don't kind of live with this day to day, then it's a non-starter. I think that's a trend that exists pretty much around it. The way in which you frame, I think, the case of Quanzhou and of Jingdezhen is good. I think in the case of Quanzhou, the fact that you compared and contrasted the failed, shall we say, case in 2018 versus the successful case in 2020, and why the 2020 was different from the 2018 was a very good way of doing that. Given that you can describe many of these cases forever, I thought that was useful. in the case of Jingdezhen, I have to admit that, as you know, I've been professionally involved in this project, and particularly with the Tao Xinchuan Creative Park. I know Liu Zili fairly well. I would argue a little more than he actually strong-armed this thing into place, because in fact, it was in a relatively calm circumstance, as you said, in Jingdezhen, but the developers could have gone in and taken the thing away. But he said, no, no, no. And he was the head of a state-owned enterprise that said, no, no developers, get out of my way. I have a whole different view of this thing. And I think he was extremely responsible for that. And knowing him, he doesn't believe either in these sort of like overarching concepts of UNESCO and so forth. I mean, the part of the story you didn't speak to very much was he in fact inveigled the Rhode Island School of Design, the Royal College of Art, the Swedish whatever it is Academy, the CAFA of the Chinese, to bring their institutions there to reinforce the case he was making for more of a handicraft, more of resituating the old industrial thing into a shall we say the position of its handicraft heritage, which is sort of what happened and what propelled the kind of redesign of the Soviet, I'm going to say Soviet built, but Sovietly emulated creative park that you showed in the illustrations. So I think he deserves quite a lot of credit for actually making that happen, working with Zhang Zhe from Tsinghua in that sort of venture. What I think you could have been a little bit more clear about is actually what the transformation was in Jingdezhen from the early days of porcelain, let's say back in the, I don't know, pick a dynasty, all the way through to when they started to modernize and then move the plants further out and all this sort of thing. I think that could have been more clearly written, frankly, because it's a fairly shall we say, non-problematic story. I mean, it's problematic from the point of view of what was produced, but it's not a hard narrative to write. So that would be one sort of criticism I might have had of the work. I like the quality of the text. I like the fact that you had people speaking in different voices. And I thought this was borrowing from Michael Hertzfeld in a way, in a useful way. It's something that Michael does quite a lot in his books, which I actually do read, Michael. These first-hand accounts I thought gave it a good sort of sense of things, actually. But at the end of the day, I thought you slipped too much into GSD speak with certain things like, for example, Bourdieu and officializing strategies, and the idea of Walder and principled particularism. And I was actually looking for more Chinese notions of Tianxia, all under one, Feng Mao, which I thought you handled fairly well. Mostly, it seems to me, it means aura of a place. And in fact, Tongbian, which has got to do with the continuity through change, which is, to me, the fundamental driving force of anything that's close to the term authenticity, which they don't use, in conservation in China. That, in fact, these timber buildings, going back to them, are expected to deteriorate. And therefore, you have to have a plan to make them stay. And this is a sort of a fact of life with them that I think you can talk about in Chinese terms, not necessarily in borrowed Western terms. And so that was one of the things that bothered me a little bit about your text, that you sort of leapt into Michael Hayes territory when you could have stayed in China territory. Sorry, Michael Hayes.
No, I completely agree. Actually, if I could, Peter, I would pick up exactly on this to make just a more brief comment. Now you guys, Peter and Michael, can correct me because I don't have the grip on the larger situation that either of you do. But the one question that I have, Boya, and part of this is how to move the dissertation forward toward publication. I was pretty far into it, still with the understanding that within the overall hypothesis that UNESCO is a, hegemonic and, universalizing Western institution, given that within that, what we were actually going to see were two Chinese cases, which, while they didn't really completely, make the system buckle, they did through things that you describe as porosity and modulations of authenticity. They actually turn out to be two different cases rather than two cases of the same thing. And this is going to be my question. I thought that Chenjo, sorry, I've learned the pinyin, and now I realize that pinyin doesn't always work in Cantonese, but Chenjo, I took that case to be more or less, as you say,
Good
generic
Chinese,
or
actually.
typical of a transportation hub, a city that had been not only regionally important, but connected to the Silk Road all along. And in some ways, the kind of, quote unquote, cleaning up, making the shutters match, just like you would in any similar status European city, you just homogenize it according to a very generic standard of urbanism, right?
Right.
And then I saw something very different going on in Gendigen, and it has to do with what Peter mentioned of the stages of production from Ming, let's say from Ming to Mao to Reform, and I know there were many others, but you remember, Peter, I asked Boya for my own sake to do a more abstract diagram of that movement from, Ming support and how the urban or the in that case almost village fabric was structured, and then when they
Now they built the big factories.
Yeah, that's right. And then the Cultural Revolution, they became more like little workshops, and now they under consumerism they change again. I found that quite effective, and I found it something that someone with your training within our program can do and make legible and make determinate, that someone just dealing in more pure sociological circles couldn't do, right? And I like that very much, but I saw it distinguishing Gendigen from Quanzhou and making it two separate cases. And I'm wondering if in terms of refining it toward publication, I don't think it contradicts what Michael was saying at all. I think what it means is that because of the vagueness of the UNESCO grid, in fact, there are some local examples of how you can make a difference within the homogeneity, I guess.
Yeah, there are many, I think, Michael. I mean, I think these are probably two. I don't know that they're archetypal or anything like that, but they're two very clear cases. But I can also think of others, even with respect to their conservation practices of things like the Forbidden City. If we look at the recent work they did, for example, for the Olympics in the Qing dynasty piece that had been fairly ruined. I mean, that's another example. It's almost like every time they turn to their own work to actually, as it were, conduct heritage aspects, there's a rather contradictory model to the uniformity and the drive of UNESCO, but it's different. It depends where you are and what the circumstances are.
Well, let me jump in if I may, because I think what this conversation is showing very nicely is, and actually I think we're all on the same page, is that there are huge variations in the way these models are applied.
Yeah.
That, we could certainly agree with Boyar and possibly even with the Chinese government that UNESCO represents a hegemonic system. But unlike Boyar, the Chinese government is saying, well, okay, so this is the system we have to live with. And if we're going to make our place in the world clear, it's not just that we want to fight it out in the military arena or in the diplomatic arena, we've got to fight it out in the culture arena. And I want to say something about that. I should have mentioned it in my earlier comments. As some of you know, I've been working for some years now on this concept of crypto-colonialism, and I'm increasingly convinced that China is in fact a case of that. That is to say, a country that was acknowledged as independent by the Western powers on condition that it agreed to do its culture, as it were, including adopting the whole idea of a national culture, very much in accordance with the way that the colonial powers dictated. I mean, I started my work on this with Greece and Thailand. I'm now doing quite a bit of work on Nepal, Iceland, oddly enough. There are quite a few, Iran, Turkey, there are quite a few candidates for inclusion. I wanted to be a flexible model. I don't want people to end up getting into nominalistic arguments about whether China is or isn't a crypto-colonial state, or some other country is or isn't, but simply to ask the question, what do we gain by looking at it in these terms? Now, one of the things I think that Roya's material shows very nicely is precisely this key element of crypto-colonialism. So as far as I recall, you don't actually use the term, but the defining characteristic for me of crypto-colonialism is when a country says, we were never colonized, therefore, we were never, we don't have any right now to be, or we're not expecting to have a right to be part of the post-colonial grumbling club, as it were. We are a state that has always had a certain level of independence, although we've had bad relations with the West from time to time. And in a way, what has happened now is that China is still playing the same game by adopting UNESCO. The more successful adaptation, I hate to say it in this context, probably Taiwan, which invented its own version of UNESCO in order to say, we too actually belong to part of the system, and we have to invent it since we're not allowed to join it. But in China, under the Chinese government, we see this UNESCO-oid discourse that is used to mask a whole variety of different approaches. And Peter, the ones that you've mentioned, I think, could use some. I mean, if I were advising, well, yeah, at this moment, you have to turn this into a book overnight. The first thing I would say is you write a preface in which you show all of these examples that Peter's just mentioned, and probably a few more, to show the variety of ways in which China repeatedly does exactly the same thing, which is that it plays the UNESCO game while denouncing the Western model that is still driving UNESCO. But I think if you do that,
I agree with that.
That's moving to the book, right? So.
Yeah, and I think actually, Michael, at the end of the day, the two cases she's chosen are pretty good because, in a sense, it's you can start off by saying, okay, China pursues different strategies in order to appear as if they're playing the game, but they're really not. And then you go into the two cases which show how politicking, that is to say, the little guys versus the big guys in given situations, interact in ways that are unexpected. And that could apply more or less across the board to all the other cases, except they would have, differences with respect to the specific.
Well, exactly. Context. That was my point. Yeah.
So the politics, so the dissertation's heart, which I've always seen as being, it's about politicking. How do you do politicking? I.e., I have a different view than what the powers above me tell. The famous Chinese saying, the emperor is far away, the sun is high in the sky and the emperor is far away. Therefore, I'm going to go do whatever I want to do. It is very much involved here. And, there's lots of ways you could do that specifically, but in general, it requires a certain style of politicking, which is where the similarities actually in these two cases come into play. You know, it's really how does the little guy take on the big guys, so to speak, right? And then, you know, the conclusions, could fall from that. I think that would be the shape of the book I would suggest. The other thing to bear in mind too is that China in, let's just say the PRC era, the People's Republic era from 1949 onwards, has gone through 3 rather dramatic shifts. You know, you had Mao Zedong, who more or less told the country to stand on its feet and be accounted, right? And then that went south with the Cultural Revolution and all that sort of thing. And then Deng Xiaoping comes in and says, look, go out there and make money, baby. You know, get rich. Then we're going to own something. And now you've got Xi Jinping, who's saying, okay, now we've got a moderately wealthy country. We need to mark our place in the world, right? 3 rather different attitudes towards their concept internally of statehood that have gone through this story. Because let's face it, the Changzhou episode that she's speaking about is relatively early, but the Jingdigen has been going on since, well, the end of the 2028, 29, something like that. Is that right? I can't remember exactly when it started.
But your 3 examples, Peter, if I may just butt in here, your 3 examples are beautiful illustrations. I mean, the way you've said it, in all 3 cases, what China is doing is essentially saying we are still measuring ourselves up to the West. This is a mark of the colonial condition.
Yeah, right. Yeah. I mean, you know, I think the only reason Xi Jinping does this sort of stuff, quite frankly, is because he's haunted by the idea of the West. He feels like he's got, I mean, look at the dopey stuff they're doing with COVID these days, with the lockdowns in Shanghai and Beijing. You know, I mean, that could undo the state, frankly, you know, because he has to maintain the mandate of heaven, you know. I mean, he's not the emperor. We don't call him that anymore, but he is an emperor, basically. I don't see the difference between him and say a Qing dynasty emperor personally. You know, it could undo him because he's sort of preconceived. He's got this thing about the West. I wish I'd like to write it to him and tell him, stop having a thing about the West. Yeah. And just get on with it.
Right. Yeah. I'm going to ask Susan Snyder to come in now, Susan, with some comments. You've been working with Boya also
before any of us.
Before, in some ways, before any of us. Yeah, just to join in.
Okay, great. Well, I really think back to Boya's master's thesis in critical conservation about the copy. And we've moved from the copy to authenticity. And I would love to see some continuity between the 2 issues you have addressed in each of these works, tying this up, because I think you have to go back to your beginning ideas about the idea of the copy and its importance in China to identity, and borrowing from the West or borrowing from the past, as you placed it in your master's thesis. But aside from all of the wonderful job you have done, I'm interested in the next step for this. The issues of the elusive authenticity are always, as you have pointed out, conflicts that are about power and who has the power to decide what is authentic. And that is underlying in no matter what country or what issue we are dealing with. But I'm interested in how the results of that definition perform. And if you could, in fact, then begin to see that different iterations of the conflict resulting in different definitions of what is authentic produce places that you might judge to have more value than others. It appears that your first example was an incredibly homogeneous branded place that was for tourists, in which the locals were most likely eliminated, or as Michael has written about, the spatial cleansing of that place. Whereas your second example, the living authenticity, is about engaging the people that are living there as well as those that come there. So I'm interested in, as your field studies continue, how you can begin to evaluate the results of this in the performance of place, the effect of what we call in critical conservation, the issues of who was included, who was excluded, the social justice issues, and how that then affects how you set the ground for this and understanding what is authentic.
Thank you.
Actually, one aspect of that in Jingdigen, which is fairly clear, and it goes back again to why on earth did Jili round up all of these sort of external institutions to come there and make pottery, right? Is because at the end of the day, he agreed with the idea that Jingdigen had to be distinctive. And this was one way to do it around the thing that Jingdigen was most famous for, which was the Dresden-like porcelain, right? Otherwise, I can't imagine why he would do that. And he did it quite successfully. Now they've got dormitories and they've got all sorts of things. In other words, he set out to use the idea of porcelain making, handicraft work, artistic, not just production, in order to invite a whole bunch of other alliances and build these alliances. And why he was never against Sanboa, for example, or about the Letian area. He liked all of this because it played into the idea of Jingdigen being a specific place in China. And it seems to me that that's at the heart of a lot of this heritage stuff, is why on earth do you do it, right? You do it to make yourself different, don't you? I've always thought that. Maybe I'm dumb, but and that was a very good tactic.
Yeah. I wonder if coming to Michael's point about those countries like China, that somehow post-colonialism doesn't seem the right name. If we would ever,
China was never colonialized.
Yeah, exactly. But would we ever?
Except by the Japanese for a period of time.
Let me add that. Let me say the diagnostic feature of what I call crypto-colonialism is precisely what you just said, Peter. It's the statement, we were never colonized. And just to illustrate this, I'll tell you that I never thought that Iceland would qualify for this. I was invited to a conference some years ago and said exactly what I just said, that this is the diagnostic feature of crypto-colonialism. And then I listened to a long debate, which I became less and less convinced that Iceland was the case, until a very distinguished and very brilliant Icelandic historian by the name of Guðmundur Hálfdanarson suddenly stood up and in ringing tones declaimed, but Iceland never was a colony, and the whole audience burst out laughing. And you could imagine a more sinister version of that happening in China, like up and saying that China never was a colony, and people being a little embarrassed perhaps to laugh because it's not something that you laugh about publicly with impunity. But the fact of the matter is that that China had been pursuing the same sorts of policies as Thailand and some of these other countries, in which the whole act has been to say, we were never colonized, we're not part of that whole system. And if you want to see how independent we are, look at how well we do what the West does. In other words, there's an imitation of Western models that is presented as nativist. And I think, Boya, you should jump in here and comment on it, but I think some of your examples illustrate that very well. Sort of, we're going to imitate the UNESCO rules. We'll play with them when we feel that it's appropriate to do so. And again, the local, I think your ethnography of the way the local people make it work for them is crucially important here. But at the end of the day, there is a great deal of imitation of Western models being presented as quintessentially Chinese.
No, I agree again, Michael, very much. And also, Xi Jinping, he's sort of, you're right, he's sort of fixated on the West, frankly, in a lot of the things he's been doing. And it's for the purposes of saying, my way of doing it is better than your way of doing it, the same thing. Even if even if both cases are sort of like not really talking to each other.
I am better at being Western than you are.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And I'm calling it Chinese. Yes. But I think I was trying to say something. Should let her. It's her thesis. We should let her.
All right, Boya, you're gonna have the last word, because we're gonna have to deliberate for a little bit.
Sure.
Oh yeah. I forgot about that.
I'm connecting both Peter's, Michael's, and Susan's comments. I'm thinking how, is China particular or universal in the trajectory of being crypto colonial? So in the two cases, I saw the emergence of so-called cultural confidence that been brought up by the national leaders multiple times, and the rise of populism in recent years, as we've seen all over the world, have contributed to the kind of the mentality of catching up with the West, even if we have been talking about this in the past, in the, for example, socialist era. But after this many years of reform and economic advancements, developments, we again come back to the mentality of catching up with the West. But this time it's not only economic catching up, but culturally, like we are distinguishing.
Soft power, yeah.
Yeah, soft power, etc. And also, I want to. There are too many things. So all of you know that in the first place, I didn't have Quanzhou in my like field work. I chose the Confucius Temple, and I chose the Wuzhen water town. And
Yeah.
so at the end
Horrible.
of the day, I found the two cases, as I said, are less extreme, because they all have the support or the strong civil society to kind of counterbalance the impacts of nationalism and consumerism. And I'm glad you brought it up, Peter, the Liu Zili, and also as in the case of Wuzhen, there are like strongman style cultured person who knows the value of diversity and creativity, and also, to use the metaphor for my dissertation, being a state of high entropy, which means you achieve a kind of dynamism through a collection or diversity of people or activities. It is better than focusing on one singular kind of identity or historic site.
Yeah. But I mean, I think actually, if I might interrupt, I think the two cases for me were good because they're about politicking. Wuzhen is never, it was just a slam dunk.
Right.
Everyone went, oh yeah, we're going to do that. The same thing with the Confucius Temple. You don't argue with Confucius in China. Come on. We go, oh yeah, we'll go do that. I mean, they're sort of like non-starters for me. Whereas these two cases actually get into the fact that you call them middle ground or whatever, which may be true, but they're where people disagree, and therefore they come up with their own way of doing it.
Yeah. Good.
They're good. I mean, in other words, they're good examples. They almost tell us, whether we're Western or Chinese or whatever, what we ought to be doing in conservation, in my view. We ought to be worrying about the livelihood heritage aspect of things, and not so much about the strictly material and objectified aspects of things, which I know you agree with.
Right. Margaret or Boya, I don't know who has control, one of you as host, to either put the three of us, Michael, Peter, and I, into a room, a breakout room, or to flush everyone else. I don't know which we do.
I can make a quick breakout room.
Okay.
That would be the best, I think.
That would be.
I think that's the best thing, probably, Margaret.
Yeah.
Let's see.
And so everyone else just.
This is creativity in action, right?
Yeah. Everyone else hold
should
tight.
just-
We'll be back directly.
You should have a little invite to join the breakout room.
Yes, it's arrived. Thank you.
Ooh. Thank you all for coming today.
Here we come. Now, Peter, Michael, we were all muted as we were transferred. So unmute yourself. Boy, I'm sorry that took so long. It was a really difficult decision whether or not.
Oh, come on.
Well,
Stop the other leg, the yodels, come on.
Sorry, Boya can take it. Boya, I just want to say, not only did you, of course, pass your defense and with an extraordinary dissertation, I want to say something a little bit different before I turn this over to Michael and Peter. I admire your intellectual growth, of course, and I'm actually proud to be a part of it. I admire as much the generosity of you as a mentor to your younger colleagues, that as you moved from MDes to DDes, you also turned into a kind of teacher, which I'm sure you're going to be brilliant at. I don't think I've had a student who can remain so focused on her own work and at the same time make a real contribution to our programs, both the master's and the doctoral programs. And I really want to thank you for that as well. Michael?
Go ahead. I'd like to completely echo that, and also my own education. As you know, I teach modern China in the school, and I'm an Asianist, and I'm sort of from that part of the world, from Southeast Asia anyway. And Boya has been my TF, my TA, my RA, whatever, for forever. And I'm going to be very sorry to see her go.
Oh dear. Well, I'm going to interrupt you, Peter, because the idea of Peter Rao being in tears is just too I would like to thank, thank Susan Snyder and George Thomas for introducing us. I think it's a critical conservation program, which alas is no longer with us, that was the channel through which Boya and I really began to interact intensively. And what I find extraordinary is I don't think I really taught you any anthropology as such, but you seem to be an anthropologist under the skin. Now, I'm not going to let my colleagues hear this too loudly, because then they're going to say, my God, you left the field and you've gone off to be something else. But actually, what's so great about this project is that you've combined the skills of an architectural historian with those of an anthropologist, looking at the day-to-day politics, as Peter said, of the analysis. And so one of the reasons we were away for a little while was not some deep-seated difficulty about whether to award you the degree, but how to advise you on turning this into a book. And I will not make a secret of the fact that I have acquisitive designs on a version of this. So that's something that you and I will be talking about in the very near future. So, congratulations.
Congratulations,
and also your verbal defense of what you were doing in the thesis was extremely adroit, because we were sneaky. We came across as looking very friendly. I, sitting here in Portugal and having had a very well-oiled lunch over 2 hours, was probably a lot more benign looking than my questions actually were, but you dealt with them with equal aplomb, and I thought that was really quite a bravura performance. So congratulations.
Thank you all. Thank you. I really enjoyed every conversation we had in the past maybe 5 or even more years. And I just benefit so much from your teaching and learning from you. And I want to thank Susan, George, for setting up the foundational kind of intellectual framework for me. I always go back to the literatures in the syllabus, and also thank them to kind of continuously support me, not only intellectually, but as a person, like teach me how to kind of be a good person, let's say. And I also enjoyed Michael's Sichuan food. flying. I hope we can gather soon and celebrate this. Thank you so much, Peter, for being such a great mentor. And I enjoy camping in your office. And thank you, Michael, who has been, we have been knowing for many years. And I really kind of admire that how you are open to a lot of my bizarre research ideas and encourage me to delve deeper into those issues. So thank you so much.
Oh.
Good.
Again,
We can go, Margaret, if you can give Boya the controller, however it works, we can go, and maybe Boya's friends would like to stay for a while and just congratulate her in person. But I'm going to leave with thanks again to Peter, to everyone, and
Yeah.
Susan, thanks to you.